that strange pickup truck in the driveway, and then I couldn't believe my own eyes. My name is Daniel, and I'm 43 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I've been married to Nicole. We met in our early 20s, back when I was fresh out of college and she was still deciding on her career path. From the very start, we had what felt like an unbreakable bond built on genuine friendship and trust. Over the years, people would often comment about how solid we seemed as a couple. Some even said we were the epitome of a stable marriage. Admittedly, I believed it, too. We'd often talk about starting a family soon, but life and work always seemed to get in the way. For the past few years, my job has required me to spend most weekdays in Austin, while our home is in San Antonio. It's roughly an hour-and-a-half drive each way, so I typically rent a small apartment near the office from Monday to Friday and come back home on weekends. Nicole and I have tried to make this arrangement work. We text, we FaceTime at night, and we plan short weekend getaways whenever we can. This summer, we've been discussing a potential trip for just the two of us, something to help us reconnect after all the hustle and bustle involving our extended family and close friends. See, Nicole and I might not have children yet, but we do have plenty of relatives and friends in our orbit. Her parents live nearby, and we're frequently involved in gatherings, birthdays, anniversaries, even random cookouts. My own parents live out of state, but my younger brother Mark and I remain close. Mark's been my rock since we were kids. I've always felt lucky to have him just a phone call away. He and his wife, Megan, live about an hour north of us, so I try to visit whenever I can. Between these social events, my work responsibilities, and Nicole's busy schedule, it's safe to say we haven't been able to spend as much quality time together as we once did. She's been working longer hours at her job in human resources, and she also decided to start volunteering at a local animal shelter. Part of me was proud. She was doing something meaningful, but it also cut further into our weekends. Still, I didn't want to complain, especially knowing how supportive she's always been of my own career moves. We talked a lot about having kids eventually. I used to imagine a future where our day-to-day focus would shift toward building a family. Soccer games on Saturdays, picking out baby names, that sort of thing. But with my commute and Nicole's new volunteer commitments, we kept pushing those plans off. Next year, we often said, or once things settled down, life felt busy yet comfortable, or at least that's what I believed. Sure, we had our share of stress, unexpected house repairs, Nicole's cousin needing a place to crash for a few weeks, my boss constantly assigning me to special projects, but none of these things ever seemed big enough to shake my faith in our marriage. My brother Mark and I joked that Nicole and I were too stubborn and too in love to let outside drama break us. After all, we'd made it this far. Looking back, maybe I was just too sure of our stability. So sure that I didn't see the cracks forming until it was too late. I'd been scheduled to return home late on a Friday night, but work at the office suddenly slowed to a crawl on Thursday afternoon. My boss told me I could take the next day off, as there were no urgent tasks left to finish. Excited at the chance for an extra night with Nicole, I made the drive from Austin to San Antonio right after dinner. I didn't call or text, thinking I'd surprise her. She texted earlier about running errands in the evening, so I pictured her coming back to our place only to find me there a day ahead of schedule. In my mind, we'd order takeout, open a bottle of wine, and savor a rare relaxing night together. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a dark blue pickup truck parked outside, definitely not anyone's vehicle I recognized. My first reaction was more confusion than alarm. Sometimes Nicole's relatives visited on short notice, but her mom drove a sedan, her dad a small SUV, and her cousin had an old Jeep. This strange truck put me on edge. A weird feeling tightened in my chest, like an anxious knot telling me something wasn't right. The house was eerily quiet when I stepped out of my car, and I realized Nicole hadn't left any lights on. I walked cautiously around to the side of the house, unsure of what exactly I was expecting to find. That's when I heard faint voices, then laughter, and finally noises that made my stomach lurch. The window to our bedroom was partly open. I hadn't planned on spying, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to confirm or deny the sense of dread building inside me. I took a few slow steps toward the window, peeked in, and saw the unthinkable. Nicole, with another man, completely naked. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. The surge of adrenaline in my veins made me feel shaky and hot with rage. I had this immediate impulse to burst through the front door and confront them, maybe even do something I'd regret. But another part of me, some self-preserving instinct, told me to leave. I couldn't handle that confrontation yet. I didn't trust myself to stay in control. Without thinking further, I turned on my heel, got back in my car, and drove away. It felt like I was in a fog, hands shaking on the steering wheel, staring at the road without really seeing it. My first stop was a liquor store, where I picked up a bottle of cheap whiskey. I had no plan, no destination in mind. The only thing clear to me was that I needed to numb the torrent of betrayal, hurt, and anger consuming me. I ended up at a half-empty motel on the outskirts of the city. I locked myself in a room, downed half of that whiskey straight from the bottle, and spent the night pacing, crying, and occasionally yelling at the walls. The heartbreak was instant, but so was the fury. I imagined worst-case scenarios, storming back home, causing a scene that might land me in jail. I knew I had to avoid Nicole, at least for now. Facing her would only push me closer to a line I wasn't sure I could cross without losing my sanity or doing irreparable damage. So I stayed holed up in that dingy motel, my phone on silent, drowning in a mix of whiskey and disbelief, fully aware that life as I knew it had just shattered. I in the throes of heartbreak and anger. I found myself alone in that dingy motel room, staring at the blinking cursor on my phone's search bar. I was too ashamed to call my parents or even text my best friend. Instead, I typed out a long, anguished post in a relationship advice forum, explaining what I just witnessed and asking strangers for guidance. Almost immediately, messages poured in, a mix of sympathy and practical tips. Some advised me to confront Nicole, others warned me against any rash action. Though I was skeptical at first, it felt oddly comforting to see that people, complete strangers, took the time to offer support. Before I knew it, I'd been up all night, scrolling through replies while sipping on the tail end of the whiskey I'd bought. Around dawn, my phone buzzed with a call from my brother, Mark. He'd been worried when I didn't come home, so he called repeatedly until I finally picked up. The moment I heard his voice, the floodgates opened. I told him everything. The strange truck, the noises in my own bedroom, how I'd fled without confronting Nicole. Mark didn't waste a second. Within hours, he arrived at the motel. True to form, he didn't judge me for my meltdown. He simply offered to take me away for a bit, saying we could crash at a hotel he knew near Lake Travis for some fishing and fresh air. I agreed, desperate for any distraction from the churning knot in my gut. On the drive, I confided in Mark about all the little red flags I'd ignored. I remembered the late-night text messages Nicole brushed off as work emergencies, the so-called yoga sessions that never seemed to improve her flexibility, and those weird hang-up calls that came at odd hours. I'd even caught her once receiving texts from someone labeled Katie from HR. But when I glanced over, she swiftly tucked her phone away. Looking back, it was so obvious. It wasn't Katie, it was him. Then Mark dropped another bomb. The man from that truck, the one with Nicole in our bedroom, was apparently married himself. A mutual acquaintance had recognized the description of his vehicle and let Mark know. That meant this wasn't just a one-off fling. Nicole had been seeing a married man on a regular basis. All of it sent my head spinning. On the one hand, I felt paralyzed by grief, uncertain if I could ever confront Nicole without exploding. On the other, I felt a grim determination to protect myself from further harm. Mark urged me to speak to an attorney just to understand my options should I file for divorce. He also suggested we gather whatever evidence we could, especially since it sounded like Nicole might try to downplay or lie about the affair. My sister-in-law, Megan, offered to help discreetly keep tabs on Nicole's whereabouts, just in case I needed more proof down the line. By the end of that weekend, I had the names of 2 divorce lawyers in my phone and a referral to a therapist who specialized in marital crises. I wasn't certain I'd go through with it, but simply having those resources made me feel less powerless. Mark and I spent the days fishing, talking about old memories, and occasionally lapsing into tense silence when reality hit. Still, that short getaway helped me breathe a bit, reminding me there was life outside the whirlwind of betrayal. In the quiet hours by the lake, I made a promise to myself. I'd reach out to a professional counselor and at least consider the path forward, be it divorce or some form of reconciliation. Because whatever happened next, I couldn't remain stuck in limbo forever. By the time I finally mustered the courage to face Nicole, 3 agonizing days had passed since I discovered her betrayal. I decided to go back to our home in San Antonio early on a Tuesday morning, halfway hoping she wouldn't be there. The place felt eerie, the air thick with the memory of what I'd witnessed. When she eventually walked in after her overnight shift at the animal shelter, I confronted her immediately. My voice trembled, and it was obvious I was in no mood for small talk. "Tell me what's going on," I demanded, hands clenched at my sides. She tried to feign ignorance, asked what I meant, why I was upset. At first, Nicole insisted it was just a misunderstanding. But the mask fell quickly when I mentioned the truck and the open window to our bedroom. Her denial collapsed into tears, and she stammered that it was only a slip, just a one-time mistake. I refused to let it go. I'd heard enough half-truths. I wanted the entire story, unvarnished and complete. Reluctantly, she confessed to more than just once. She'd been meeting him, the other man, for the past month. His name was Andrew, and indeed, he was married. Hearing it said out loud was like a punch to my gut, even though I already knew. I asked her why, demanded she tell me how she could do this after nearly 2 decades of marriage. Nicole cried and insisted she still loved me, that it was an emotional mistake born out of our constant separations, her loneliness, and their shared volunteer shifts at the shelter. Her excuses did nothing to ease the tidal wave of hurt I felt. I then dropped my own bombshell. I informed her that I had every intention of letting Andrew's wife know what was happening. "She deserves the truth just as much as I do," I said, stepping back from her tearful attempts to hug me. Nicole looked horrified, but she couldn't deny the logic. She reached for her phone, trembling, and dialed Andrew in speaker mode. When his voice crackled through, she told him she was done, that he had to tell his wife about their affair. I could hear him begging her not to involve his family, but she stood firm for once, saying it was too late for secrets. Immediately afterward, Nicole called his wife, who apparently recognized her number. The conversation was brief and brutal. Nicole apologized, and Andrew's wife, her voice shaking with rage, hung up mid-sentence. That's when Nicole sank to her knees, grabbing at my hands, her face puffy and red with tears. She begged me to forgive her, frantically offering every possible olive branch. A romantic getaway, signing up for couples counseling, even trying to be intimate right then and there. Anything to prove she was still my wife. Her desperation broke my heart, but it also disgusted me. The trust I'd once had in her felt irreparably smashed. All the programs she suggested felt hollow in the face of what she'd done. For the better part of 2 hours, we stood in the living room, volleying back and forth between accusations, half-finished explanations, and anguished apologies. She admitted how they'd started seeing each other secretly at the shelter, grabbing coffee after shifts, and how it grew into repeated meetups at our home. I demanded to know why she risked our marriage, and she could only sob that she never intended to lose me. But we both knew the damage was done. Eventually, I couldn't handle her tears or her pleas anymore. Numb and exhausted, I told her I needed space, grabbed a few of my things, and left. The final image burned into my mind was of her, crumpled on the floor, begging me not to walk out the door. Yet all I felt was a hollow ache, the echoes of a relationship I once believed was unbreakable. I left the house that same afternoon with only a duffel bag stuffed full of clothes and a few keepsakes I couldn't stand to leave behind. The gravity of the situation was settling in like a heavy fog. For nearly 2 decades, that home had been our shared space. Now it felt irreversibly tainted. My first instinct was to call my brother, Mark, who immediately told me to come stay with him. His wife, Megan, agreed without hesitation, and in less than an hour, I was pulling into their driveway. She gave me a sympathetic hug while Mark helped unload the bag from my car. I felt a surge of guilt and relief at the same time. Guilt for imposing on them, and relief for having a safe haven. Once I caught my breath, I contacted my manager in Austin. I explained I'd be going through some personal turmoil and asked if the company's extended stay arrangement, originally for traveling employees, was still an option. Fortunately, they granted my request, and I was able to secure a temporary studio apartment near the office. It wasn't luxurious, but it offered privacy and a chance to focus on my job instead of wallowing in heartbreak every moment of the day. Over the phone, Mark assured me I could still crash at his place whenever I needed a break from staring at four walls alone. The next move was an inevitable one. I told Nicole via text that I was in contact with a divorce attorney and that I saw no immediate path to reconciliation. She responded with a flurry of frantic messages, alternating between anger, despair, and self-pity. At one point, she even texted, "I don't deserve to live if I've ruined your life like this." It tore at me. I'd spent half my life loving this person, but I was determined not to let emotional manipulation sway me. I'd read enough stories and spoken to enough people to know that suicidal threats sometimes arise during these crises. Nonetheless, I called her father, Richard, to express concern about her mental health. Richard surprised me by showing unwavering support. He admitted he was furious at Nicole for her betrayal and promised to keep an eye on her. "You need to do what's best for you, son," he said quietly, treating me more like family than ever before. My days became a chaotic swirl of logistical and emotional tasks. First, I made an appointment with a divorce lawyer in downtown Austin. We discussed grounds for divorce, property division, and the possibility that Nicole's affair might affect proceedings. The lawyer was sympathetic, but also realistic. It could get messy if Nicole decided to contest anything. After that, I met with a therapist my coworker recommended. Sitting in that softly lit office, I laid out the entire story, from the late-night discovery to the tumultuous confession. The therapist encouraged me to maintain strict boundaries for a while, given how raw my feelings were. I took the advice to heart. I blocked Nicole from calling my personal phone, allowing only a limited text option for strictly necessary communication, like splitting our bills for the time being. Despite her barrage of voice messages, through mutual friends, even trying my work number, I kept my interactions minimal. Each time I heard her pleading in a voicemail, it clawed at my insides. But I reminded myself that every conversation ended in spiraling arguments. As word spread among our extended network of friends, I saw the entire range of reactions. Some were appalled by Nicole's actions and rallied behind me, offering places to crash or a sympathetic ear. Others insisted I should attempt marriage counseling with her before making any final decisions. A few acquaintances, including some mutual friends, remained neutral or even quietly questioned whether I might share some blame for being gone so much. Nonetheless, the outpouring of empathy from my parents, brother, and even my father-in-law anchored me. Their solidarity helped me remain steadfast in my decision to separate, at least until I could see a clear path forward. In all honesty, a part of me still loved Nicole deeply, but it wasn't enough to erase the betrayal that loomed like a shadow over every memory we shared. Between my new living arrangement at the company's apartment, the lawyer's input, and the counselor's support, I gradually found myself leaning more firmly toward divorce. My future was far from certain, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living in the limbo of heartbreak and false hope any longer. For all the progress I'd made, meeting with the lawyer, finding a temporary apartment, and limiting communication with Nicole, I still hadn't filed the divorce papers. I suppose some part of me was hoping for a miraculous revelation, or at least a sense of clarity about which direction my life should take. Every time I tried to envision signing on that dotted line, I pictured the 2 decades we spent together. College-age dreamers who fell in love, the countless celebrations we shared with friends and family, the way we used to laugh over silly inside jokes. All those memories rattled around in my head, making it hard to finalize what seemed like the inevitable. My sessions with the therapist started to dig into that conflict. Did I really want out of the marriage, or was I holding on to some small shred of optimism that Nicole could change? If I chose to end things officially, could I handle the emotional fallout? If I stayed, could I ever truly forgive and move forward? Each question felt like an anchor weighing me down. Now and then, I'd catch myself daydreaming about a scenario where Nicole and I somehow patched up our differences, went to couples therapy, and emerged stronger. Then I'd recall the look in her eyes, or the feeling of stepping into my own bedroom and realizing I'd been betrayed. The collision of hope and hurt left me constantly teetering between wanting to preserve what we had and wanting to burn it all down. Despite the legal advice and my friends' opinions, I never actually posted a formal update about my final decision. Maybe it was because I was paralyzed by indecision, or maybe I just didn't want the world dissecting my most vulnerable moment. Over time, the calls from Nicole slowed, but never really stopped. Every once in a while, she'd text me a heart-wrenching apology or a nostalgic memory she thought might soften me. And I'll admit, some part of me still softened. That's where my story paused, for lack of a neat resolution. There's no clear record of whether I put my name on the divorce papers or if I decided to give our marriage another try. People who knew me, friends, acquaintances, even internet bystanders who followed my ordeal, formed their own theories. Some were convinced I'd never be able to trust Nicole again, that I'd go through with the divorce and eventually find someone new. Others pointed out how deep our history was, speculating I might forgive her for a one-time or month-long lapse, especially if she truly committed to repairing our relationship. It's entirely possible, they guessed, that I regained a glimmer of faith and chose reconciliation. After all, I dedicated nearly half my life to loving her, and the idea of starting over with someone else could be scarier than facing our painful issues head-on. But then again, heartbreak changes people in ways we can't predict. Even if I'd considered the idea of forgiving her, the echoes of betrayal might have been too loud to ignore forever. So that's where things stand. Uncertain and full of question marks. My trust was demolished, and the emotional toll was immense. I had options: pursue divorce wholeheartedly, or attempt to salvage our marriage through therapy and Nicole's remorse. Both paths seemed daunting, and I was left in a limbo, trying to decide if a shattered love can truly be mended or if it's wiser to let it go. The final chapters remain unwritten, leaving anyone who followed my story to wonder if I ever found closure or if, in some unexpected twist, I managed to rebuild what was so painfully broken.